From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
We need the partners who want to help us to come as fast as possible. We need them yesterday. But if until today they are not here, they should not wait for another day. They should come tomorrow.
As Sierra Leone records 121 deaths from Ebola in a single day, the country's president pleads for more international support. We'll talk about the Ebola outbreak and other medical issues with Dr. Atul Gawande, a practicing surgeon, prize-winning writer. He's out with a new book, Being Mortal, Medicine and What Matters in the End.
Virtually everybody who passes away does not do so with a sudden heart attack, and that's that. It is a months-long dealing with a terminal cancer or a congestive heart failure and so on, and we do not have the rituals for how to even talk about what that process is like.
Dr. Atul Gawande for the hour. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The Supreme Court has dealt a major victory for marriage equality by rejecting appeals from 5 states that sought to ban same-sex marriage. The decision leaves intact lower court rulings that struck down same-sex marriage bans in Virginia, Utah, Oklahoma, Indiana, and Wisconsin. Rob McPherson, a plaintiff in the Indiana case, celebrated the ruling with his husband, Stephen Stolen.
We've been together for 27 years, and this just kind of makes it official, and we can check a few boxes and get some health insurance for Stephen because he needed health insurance. They can't deny that for me anymore or for him anymore, and our daughter is protected if something happened to us, so that's the most awesome thing.
Within hours of the ruling, county clerks across the 5 states began issuing marriage licenses to same-sex couples. The Supreme Court's decision will also expand same-sex marriage rights to 6 additional states, which are covered by the same federal appeals courts as the initial 5: Colorado, Wyoming, Kansas, West Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. That'll bring the total number of states where same-sex marriage is legal to 30. A majority of the country. U.S.-led warplanes are targeting Islamic State militants near the besieged Syrian town of Kobani along the Turkish border. Kurdish forces are struggling to push back the militants after they advanced into the town Monday, claiming eastern neighborhoods and causing hundreds of civilians to flee. U.S.-led strikes in the area over the past 2 weeks have so far failed to halt the militants' advance. If the militants capture Kobani, they will control a large swath of the Turkish-Syrian border. According to U.S. Central Command, the United States and its allies have carried out over 340 airstrikes in Iraq and Syria as of Monday, about 70% of them in Iraq. Apart from 8 strikes aimed at the Khorasan group, all of the strikes targeted the Islamic State. Central Command says the airstrikes hit combat positions, training camps, and arm caches, and destroyed or damaged more than 300 vehicles, including dozens of U.S.-built Humvees taken by the Islamic State from Iraqi forces. Central Command also said it's begun flying helicopters in Iraq for the first time as part of the campaign. The step could put U.S. troops at risk of fire from militants on the ground. A new report finds a large percentage of the ammunition used by Islamic State militants in Iraq and Syria came from the United States. The London-based group Conflict Armament Research analyzed small-caliber ammunition recovered from the militants. While the cartridges it recovered originated in 21 countries, including China and Russia, nearly 20% of them came from the United States. The report states, quote, IS forces appear to have acquired a large part of their current arsenal from stock seized from or abandoned by Iraqi defense and security forces. The U.S. gifted much of this material to Iraq, they said. More than 100 people are missing after a boat carrying migrants from Syria and sub-Saharan Africa sank in the Mediterranean Sea off the coast of Libya. Dozens of other migrants were rescued. A report last month found more than 3,000 migrants have died crossing the Mediterranean Sea to Europe this year, more than twice the previous high from 2011. A U.S. drone strike has killed 6 people in northwest Pakistan. Unnamed intelligence officials told Reuters the target was a suspected militant training camp in the Shwal area of South Waziristan. Tuesday's attack was at least the 3rd U.S. strike on the area in 3 days. The 2 earlier strikes killed 5 people each on Sunday and on Monday. Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta has announced he's temporarily stepping down in order to face charges of crimes against humanity at the International Criminal Court. Kenyatta and his deputy, William Ruto, both stand accused of inciting ethnic violence, which killed 1,200 people after Kenya's 2007 election. By turning power over to Ruto during a hearing this week, Kenyatta will avoid becoming the first sitting president to appear before the court. He said he took the step to preserve Kenyan sovereignty.
I now take the extraordinary and unprecedented step of invoking Article 147(3) of the Constitution, and I will shortly issue the legal notice necessary to appoint Honorable William Ruto, the Deputy President, as acting President while I attend the status conference at The Hague in the Netherlands.
The U.S. practice of force-feeding hunger-striking prisoners at Guantanamo Bay is receiving an unprecedented public hearing in civilian court. The case involves a Syrian hunger striker imprisoned for over a decade. Abu al-Diab remains at Guantanamo despite being cleared for release in 2009. He's been on hunger strike periodically for 7 years to protest his indefinite detention. Diab's attorneys are challenging force-feeding practices, including forced cell extractions where prisoners are hauled from their cells for force feedings by a team of soldiers in riot gear, as well as the use of what prisoners call the torture chair, where their heads and all 4 limbs are restrained as a feeding tube is inserted in their nose. The Justice Department tried to keep this week's hearing secret on national security grounds, but U.S. District Court Judge Gladys Kessler rejected that request. She also ordered videotapes of Diab's force feedings to be publicly released after they are redacted. Former Guantanamo prisoner Moazzam Begg has said he offered to help secure the release of British hostage Alan Henning, who was executed by Islamic State militants last week. Begg, who heads the prisoner advocacy group CAGE, spent 3 years in U.S. custody without charge or trial and was recently rearrested and held for 7 months on terrorism charges in Britain. He was released after the case against him collapsed. Before his arrest, Moazzam Begg had begun talks with the British Foreign Office over helping to secure the release of Henning, the taxi driver who was on an aid mission in Syria. Begg told the BBC he wanted to send a video message he believed the militants would heed.
I can make a video message, deliver it in the language, the terminology, the wording that Islamic State would understand, to say that I myself was a former Guantanamo prisoner dressed in orange, or facing execution possibly because the Americans had built the execution chambers. Abu Bakr Baghdadi himself had been a prisoner of the Americans. So it was a very heartfelt, very direct statement that I wanted to make in the Arabic language.
Moazzam Begg said he had spent time in Syria before the rise of ISIS and secured the release of other hostages. He said the British government failed to look at his offers seriously due to, quote, its attempt to demonize and criminalize me, he said. To see our interviews with Moazzam Begg over the years, we went to Britain to interview him after he was released by U.S. authorities. You can go to democracynow.org. The Mexican government has sent federal police to take over security in the southern state of Guerrero following the disappearance of 43 students and the discovery of a mass grave with dozens of burned bodies. The students, who are from a rural teachers' college, have been missing for well over a week after police and unknown gunmen ambushed their buses near the small city of Iguala, where they had gone to solicit donations for their school. 22 police officers have been detained, and the city's mayor and police chief appear to have fled rather than face questioning. The police have been accused of collaborating with a drug gang called Guerreros Unidos. Mexican President Enrique Peña Nieto vowed to bring the perpetrators to justice.
I particularly regret the violence that has occurred, and above all else, that they are mostly young students who have been affected, and their rights violated in the municipality of Iguala. Mexican society, the families of the young people who unfortunately went missing, are rightly demanding clarification on the incident and that justice be done. that those found be brought to justice, and that there is no impunity in this case.
Meanwhile, the families of the missing students have continued to protest the government, saying officials are not doing enough to find their loved ones. Macedonia Torres, the mother of a missing student, said authorities would do more if it was their child missing.
They will move heaven and earth to find them. This is what we're going to do. We're going to do whatever it takes to find them, and we will not rest until we do.
Women's health providers in Texas have asked the Supreme Court to block sweeping anti-choice restrictions that have gutted abortion access in Texas. A decision by a federal appeals court last week allowed hospital-style building requirements to go into immediate effect, shuttering all but 8 abortion facilities in Texas that previously had more than 40. It also forced the only 2 remaining clinics in the Rio Grande Valley to close. Abortion patients who arrived at Whole Woman's Health in the city of McAllen Friday were told the nearest legal abortion facility was now about 4 hours north. Whole Woman's Health and other providers have filed an emergency application asking the High Court to intervene, saying, quote, "We're being forced to turn women away from safe, compassionate health care simply because of our politicians' ideological agenda," unquote. Immigrant women imprisoned in South Texas have accused guards of sexually assaulting them. The Karnes County Detention Center just opened in August. It's run by the private firm, the Geo Group. The center holds more than 500 mothers and children, most of whom are seeking asylum after fleeing violence and persecution in Central America. A federal complaint filed last week says guards are promising women help their immigration cases in return for sexual favors and removing them from their cells at night to sexually abuse them. We'll have more on the new family detention center as well as on the crisis of abortion access in Texas on Wednesday when we broadcast live from San Antonio. Members of the Ohio Student Association have occupied the police station in the town of Beaver Creek to protest the fatal police shooting of John Crawford. A 22-year-old African-American, Crawford was killed inside a Walmart in August when a 911 caller falsely accused him of pointing a gun at customers. In fact, Crawford had picked up an unloaded BB air rifle, which was on sale at the store. A grand jury declined to indict the officer who fatally shot him. Last night, about 20 students slept in the lobby of the Beaver Creek Police Department. They're demanding the firing of the officer who shot Crawford and criminal charges against the 911 caller, Ronald Ritchie, whose account was contradicted by surveillance footage. A federal judge has ruled police in Ferguson, Missouri, violated the Constitution when responding to protests over the fatal police shooting of 18-year-old African-American Michael Brown. The case concerned the police practice of forcing protesters to remain in constant motion, telling them they were not allowed to stand still or that they were walking too slowly. And the activist, professor, and writer Betty Reed Mandel, a longtime advocate for welfare rights, has died in Massachusetts at the age of 89. Known locally as the fairy godmother of the welfare office, Mandel distributed survival tips to help homeless people obtain aid and published frequent articles challenging what she saw as a war against the poor. She was a former editor of the journal New Politics, along with Marvin Mandel, her husband of 60 years. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Aaron Matte. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. Well, Sierra Leone is pleading for more international help to fight the Ebola outbreak in West Africa. On Saturday, the country recorded 121 deaths in one of the single deadliest days since the disease appeared more than 4 months ago. Sierra Leone President Ernest Bai Koroma spoke on Monday.
But in all of this, I believe
in all of this, we should be mindful that Ebola is still around. We need more treatment centers. We need at least 1,000 treatment centers in the whole country. And what we are doing is our responsibility. And as a government and Sierra Leoneans, it is our responsibility to do it. But we need the partners who want to help us to come as fast as possible. We need them yesterday. But if until today they are not here, they should not wait for another day. They should come tomorrow.
At least 678 people have now died in Sierra Leone. Overall, the World Health Organization says at least 3,439 people have died of Ebola in West Africa. But the actual toll is believed to be higher. In Washington, President Obama said his administration is working on additional protocols for screening airplane passengers to identify people who might have Ebola. But he ruled out a travel ban on West Africa.
We're also going to be working on protocols to do additional passenger screening, both at the source and here in the United States. All of these things make me confident that here in the United States, at least, the chances of an outbreak of an epidemic here are extraordinarily low.
The first patient diagnosed with Ebola on U.S. soil, Thomas Eric Duncan, remains in critical condition at a Dallas hospital. He was diagnosed after flying in from Liberia, the country worst hit by the epidemic. Duncan, who is a Liberian citizen, is now receiving an experimental therapy initially intended for other viral diseases. The handling of Duncan's case has raised questions about how U.S. hospitals are prepared to handle an Ebola outbreak. On September 25th, Duncan sought treatment at Texas Health Presbyterian Hospital after he began feeling ill. Despite telling a nurse he had just returned from Liberia, he was initially discharged with antibiotics. On September 28th, he returned to the same hospital by ambulance after vomiting outside the apartment complex where he was staying. He was then diagnosed with Ebola. Meanwhile, in Spain, a nurse in Madrid has become the first person to contract the disease outside of West Africa. She had treated an Ebola-stricken priest who died after returning to Spain from Sierra Leone.
To talk more about Ebola and other health issues, we have our own doctor in the House, Dr. Atul Gawande, one of the most influential health policy writers in the country. Dr. Gawande is a surgeon at the Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston and a professor at Harvard Medical School. He's also a staff writer at The New Yorker. He's the author of several books, including The Checklist Manifesto, How to Get Things Right. His most recent book has just been published. It's called Being Mortal: Medicine and What Matters in the End. We'll talk about the new book in the coming segments, but we're going to start off with Ebola. Welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you back, Dr. Gawande. Let's talk for a moment about the piece you just wrote on Mr. Duncan and what happened in this Texas hospital.
Well, it showed some of the gaps we've had that I've been writing about for a long time. The Checklist Manifesto was hit on the idea that, we know the checklist for what needs to be done when people come in with potentially infectious disease. They actually deployed the checklist at this hospital about asking about somebody who has a fever and their travel history. The nurse captured that he'd been to Africa. He actually didn't tell them Liberia. It was a more vague, said Africa, but she recognized that this might be an Ebola case, entered it into the records, and then the doctors, there was a communication breakdown. The doctors didn't pick it up. This kind of breakdown, though, likely happens all over the country all the time. This was not a special event there, and I think it has forced our hospitals to realize they have to download the checklists and then learn how to use them. The big mistake, the most common failure, is a communication breakdown like this, the failure to pass information that's critically important.
I wanted to go back for a moment to the Checklist Manifesto. It doesn't directly relate to Ebola, but the point that you are making about, a surgeon, as you are, being in surgery and what it means just to acknowledge the people, the nurses and the others, who are with him to assist him. Talk about that whole scenario.
Well, so this is almost a philosophical issue in our profession, right? Do we follow the known procedures that exist, or do we just kind of go with our judgment every time? Well, in the operating room, the known ways to make it go more safely is there are a few things you do around infection practices. There are a few things you do in communication. You make sure that the nurses have a chance to speak up and name their concerns. You make sure that the anesthesiologist has reviewed the medical history and specific concerns of the patient, and then the surgeon reviews what the major concerns are and plans they have for the operation. You'd think we do this every time, right? It's like getting in an airplane, you run the before takeoff checklist. we hadn't. We found that making that go into place, we could lower the death rate 18 to 47%.
Knowing the nurses' names lowers the death rate?
Yeah, knowing who your team is, everybody introduced, everybody huddle. It's like, you know, a football team having the huddle before they go to the line. If they didn't have the huddle, people wouldn't necessarily know. They just assume you know where the ball is going. Same thing happened on Ebola. So in an operating room, we are seeing 18 to 47% reductions in death when people use these kinds of basic tools. The Netherlands implemented this across the country, and compared to their control group, they lowered the death rate 47%. We have a project in the entire state of South Carolina making sure that this happens across the state. And it's hard to pull off because it's a cultural barrier. That's the barrier we saw in the Texas hospital, but it's happening all over the country. 2 million people come into hospitals, and they pick up infections in the hospital that they didn't come in with because people weren't wearing the gowns properly, putting on the gloves properly, washing hands properly. We know how to do the right thing, but we don't always systematically walk our way through it.
You talk about the importance of simple verbal confirmation.
Yeah. So the breakdown here, the most common kind of breakdown in the safety of hospitals is people don't communicate the critical information. Just because you put it in the computer doesn't mean anybody is going to know it and use it. And it's called closed-loop communication. In high-risk other industries, you communicate verbally to somebody else the critical information and make sure they received it and understood it, either one way or another. It could be electronically confirming that they got the information, or face-to-face. Well, if you're concerned you got someone with Ebola, you don't put it in the computer. You tell them and you hear that it's been fed back. And that's where it broke down.
I mean, this also goes to the whole issue of digital medical records. Having spent time visiting people in hospitals, seeing the frustration of the nurses and the doctors spending more time facing this computer screen, trying to figure out how to categorize particular things when they want to just convey impressions that they have.
Yeah, we're in the, I would call it the DOS Windows phase of American computerization. There's no question that having the computers has made life incredibly safer for patients, that there's information that you would otherwise not have, that prescriptions aren't, you know, illegible and hard to read. But at the same time, we are now spending our lives facing the computer screen instead of the patients. Polls, surveys that have looked at demoralization among clinicians find that the computers are themselves causing tremendous demoralization. We've all become data entry workers, spending more and more time entering data and not doing what is really the work of taking good care of patients. The design of the systems is what has to change. We need that user-friendly, make it easier to be an expert taking care of folks along the way. And I don't think that the computer industry is waking up to that yet.
Go larger than Mr. Duncan in this Texas hospital. Talk about the Ebola crisis. Thousands of people are now dead. You have the president of Sierra Leone desperately reaching out for help. What is going wrong here? Why isn't this being contained? And what are the implications of this for public health?
Yeah, the epidemic in West Africa is severe, and it's getting worse fast. And what people don't understand is this outbreak started last December. Starting at March 31st, Doctors Without Borders said the hospitals in Guinea and in Liberia are overwhelmed, and they were crying for help. As late as September 2nd, they were telling the UN and others that the help being provided is a shambles, that this is a disease that is doubling in the number of cases every 3 weeks, and our response was pathetic. We simply mounted no substantial response. It might have been the best thing that has happened, that the first case to leave the African continent came to America, because it brought our mobilization to realize what happens there matters to us here. And suddenly we are now mobilizing thousands of people to go. The CDC has mounted the largest global operation for public health in U.S. government history. And it is going to be working district by district to create emergency treatment units and isolate the sources. Now, what the second part of this is a disease that's eminently stoppable with basic public health measures, the most basic infection control measures that we generally should be following in our own hospitals. And so it's highlighting the fact that it's in the places where the health systems are broken down. You have people being turned away from hospitals because the beds are overwhelmed.
There are calls now for closing borders, even for a travel ban here in the U.S. from West Africa. What's your take on that?
So it's a real danger to do that. In order to stem the tide, one of the things that the models show is that if you just try to shut this down with a travel ban, healthcare workers can't get in. The disease just explodes within the confined area. It spreads even more widely, and you've only delayed it coming abroad by a few weeks. The reality is that we will see a few cases over the next months that may come here. We know how to contain it. We know what the checklist is for taking care of it, and it will not become an epidemic here. The general public is not at risk. This is a hard virus to spread. It's harder than the common cold. It does not spread in the air. It spreads because if you have contact with the vomit, the blood, the stool, the saliva of someone who is actively sick and infected, you are the only one at risk, and those are caregivers. That's why the people getting this are healthcare workers and family members. And basic measures end up containing it, and containing it very quickly.
Doesn't this also go to the issue of public versus corporate health? I mean, with epidemics like these, it's not in the interest of corporations to have developed cures for this. They don't have a large profit margin. World Health Organization, World Health Assembly all had their budgets gutted at a time when it seems we need this more than ever.
Yeah, the vaccine for Ebola has been in development for more than a couple of years in advance. And the interest in it was never going to come from a for-profit corporation because, you know, you couldn't bank on there being this kind of epidemic to drive it. And so instead, the government, you know, you need public investment in public health and in this kind of research. It sat fallow. Now there's tremendous interest, and now you have the NIH and a pharmaceutical company gearing back up this drug that was on the shelf for a couple of years.
We're talking with Dr. Atul Gawande. He is author of a number of books, The Checklist Manifesto. His most recent book, though, is Being Mortal, Medicine and What Matters in the End. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. Window, the album Leaf, here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Aaron Maté.
Well, for all of our advances in medicine, we turn now to a new book that calls for a radical transformation in how we approach the end of life. In his latest book, Dr. Atul Gawande argues that a rigid focus on prolonging life can often undermine what's best for a dying patient. Dr. Gawande writes, quote, "Medical science has rendered obsolete centuries of experience, tradition, and language about our mortality. And our reluctance to honestly examine the experience of aging and dying has increased the harm we inflict on people and denied them the basic comforts they most need."
The book is called Being Mortal, Medicine and What Matters in the End, by our guest, the physician and best-selling author, Dr. Atul Gawande, surgeon at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, staff writer at The New Yorker, professor at Harvard Medical School. This is his fourth book, with the others, The Checklist Manifesto, How to Get Things Right. I wanted to go to the first line of your introduction, Atul. You say, "I learned about a lot of things in medical school, but mortality wasn't one of them."
Yeah, we don't teach about, we teach doctors how to try to save people. We teach very little about how we manage the realities of what we cannot fix. And the place we've ended up in is a health system that not only has the basic public health failures we described in the previous segment, but then this other failure, which is the ability to manage mortality. I have been a surgeon for more than a decade now in cancer surgery, taken care of a lot of people who've died, and could see that my own skills were inadequate for helping people navigate what is normal: denial, anxiety, the desire to have everything thrown at you. And there have been this series of studies that have brought home how badly this is going. A study at the Mass General Hospital is just one example. They took lung cancer patients, stage 4 cancer patients, who had on average just 11 months that they lived after the study started. Half of them got usual oncology care. The other half got usual oncology care, plus a palliative care physician who had discussions with them early in the course about what happens if and when things don't work out so well. The group who got the conversations ended up spending fewer days in the hospital, stopped chemotherapy earlier, went on to hospice sooner, had less suffering at the end of their lives, and they lived 25% longer. We're making bad decisions because we are unwilling as a profession and as families to begin earlier the discussions and planning for how we deal with end of life or just the aging process.
You profile many cases in your book where patients suffer because of an inability to reckon with death or a refusal to do so. I'm wondering if you can profile one of them for us, Sarah Thomas Maloney.
Yeah, Sarah Monopoly. So this was one that brought home to me. She was a 34-year-old woman who was diagnosed in her 8th month of pregnancy with metastatic lung cancer. I mean, this is as hard as you possibly can get. And she knew it was not curable. But you want treatments that can extend the time you had. She got her infant baby and wanted to spend as much time as she could with her new daughter, but she knew the end would come. We all had a plan that we would not have this end with, flogging her to the bitter end and having no quality of life in the end. And yet the train still went down that track. And I was part of that team and made that happen. What I found was that we had an inability to recognize and even ask questions about the fact that people have priorities besides just living longer. Priorities that include things like, well, I really care about whether my brain works as time goes on, whether I'm suffering with daily pain or not. The power that comes from the fact that we can have discussions was reflected to me in my own father's case, where he had a brain cancer in his brainstem and spinal cord. We had the conversations that I learned from palliative care physicians and others.
And explain when you say palliative care.
Yeah. So palliative care is the specialty that has evolved for how to make sure that people's well-being is preserved in the course of their life, especially when they have chronic illness or terminal illness. Palliative care is often paired with hospice, where if you reach the stage where you're at the last 6 months of your life, you can be eligible to move into care that's really about having your best possible day today instead of sacrificing your time today for the sake of the future. So what the people in palliative care do is they just have some basic questions that we don't ask and never learned in medicine. Things like, tell me what your understanding of your condition is. Tell me what your fears and your worries are about the future. Tell me your goals if time becomes short. And tell me what outcomes are unacceptable to you. That was what we failed to ask Sarah Monopoly. But when we asked them for my father going through his brain cancer, that gave us the direction where we understood, what really mattered to him. He was a social person. He was a very active person. So he went through surgery to preserve that capability. But when chemotherapy started to take that away, that's when we stopped.
Talk about your grandfather, because that goes to the issue of how cultures honor aging or marginalize people who are getting older.
Yeah, my grandfather had the kind of old age that I think we're nostalgic for. He actually lived in a rural village until the age of 110 in India. 13 children. He was surrounded by family all the way to the end. If he was in America, he would have been in a nursing home in the last years of his life. Instead, he was supported by family at the head of the dinner table every night. Often consulted on business decisions still and marriages right to the end. It was a way that we wish we all could have. But the reason it worked was because it enslaved young people. And enslaving young people meant that it was often young women whose futures were tied to what happened to his future. And the progress of countries, whether it was us in the 19th century or India and China and Korea today, comes from giving young people their freedom to work where they want, live where they want, to marry whom they want.
You're saying it enslaved young people?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, he had sons in their 80s still wondering when they would inherit land so they could have a living in the future. So, we moved to a place of freedom. And moving to freedom meant that young people went to the city, they became more prosperous, but we had no plan, whether it was the 19th century in America or 21st century today in India, for what happens with the elderly left behind. And our answer became, medicine will take care of that. Medicine has proved to be an extraordinarily expensive way to take care of it. Great when we have treatments that can repair problems, replace an arthritic knee, like my mother had just a couple years ago. But when it's a problem that has only mounting difficulties, my father's brain cancer, simply the old age of my grandfather, putting people in the hospital and expecting that that's going to fix things doesn't work.
You mentioned the nursing home. What's your main critique of that system and how should it be reformed?
So the main difficulty we have is that by putting medical values into the places that take care of us as we face the realities of mortality, it extends well before end of life. It happens when you start needing help because you simply can't get around it anymore. You move into a nursing home, though, and health and safety and survival are their top values. And the result is you lose what matters to you in life, which includes your own freedom. In nursing homes, I described the case of my wife's grandmother who entered a nursing home around the same time my grandfather in India was aging. And her experience was she couldn't wear the shoes she wanted because they weren't safe. The heels were too high. She had no privacy because no one focused on that because that's not a matter of safety or survival. She couldn't eat the food she wanted because that could be, some of it could be safe. You'll see the biggest complaint with Alzheimer's patients, for example, is that they won't stick to just eating the pureed food they're supposed to eat. And you'll see Alzheimer's patients who will hoard cookies. Like, give them the damn cookies. Let them have something more than to live for than just safety and survival. And that's what, there's a whole group of pioneers, some of them call themselves nursing home abolitionists, who are remaking how senior care works. I think we get really excited about the innovation of what technologies can do. To me, some of the most exciting innovation in America is happening in the ways that people are redesigning the places we care for the elderly so that they can make choices and have lives they want to live.
Isn't part of the problem is that they are segregated, that there's no longer that intergenerational atmosphere around them. This remarkable film that came out of Sundance of a social worker, it was called Alive Inside, who goes into nursing homes and puts earphones on older people who haven't contact in the world at all, almost seem comatose, and suddenly they come alive. And what they're doing now is kids are coming in after school with their favorite music, playing it for older people. It might not even be just the music. It might be the kids with the older people.
I profile a retirement home with nursing home facilities that's also attached to a school. And the elderly go in and teach classes. Just because you're in a wheelchair doesn't mean you can't contribute anymore. They go in and teach and tutor in the library, and vice versa. The students take courses and then take care of the elderly with exceptional needs. I tell the story of a young man who cared for, as part of his school, a elderly man who died after severe dementia, and the family had him give the eulogy at his funeral. You know, there is this possibility, and some of these places there's experiments in every state in the country now that have created places like these, and we need to see that, and they don't even cost more. This is just a mentality that we have to have.
I was deeply moved in your book about the geriatric ward floor that you never even bothered to walk into, you said, for all the years you just passed it. Talk about the experience of sitting there with the lead geriatrician and his patient, Gene.
Yeah, this brought home to me how we're utterly failing to teach basic skills that geriatricians understand. So he had And
what is a geriatrician?
A geriatrician takes care of the elderly, people predominantly over age 75 or 80 who are developing the problems of aging. You know, so a hard person, you know, how do you say to mom, let's go see a geriatrician today, right? But when he saw his patients, he would be willing to take the time to deal with. They have high blood pressure, they have bad knees, they have, you know, this past lung cancer this woman had. They have a lot of issues, and what he recognized was, how do you cut through that to recognize what the most threatening concerns are for a person's life and what they want?
Well, tell us Gene's story, because it really was astonishing what you thought was important and what this doctor thought was important.
So what I thought most important was there was a nodule seen on her lung film on an x-ray that might be a possible cancer, maybe, maybe not. And what the doctor said was that the geriatrician recognized the most significant danger to this woman was she was going to fall. And he recognized that by looking really carefully at her feet, knowing how to examine the feet. We don't even teach that, honestly.
Well, explain. He said to her, take off your shoes.
Yeah. He said every patient has to be examined with their shoes and socks off. He would watch how they took off their socks and shoes to see whether they were able to reach down enough to actually care for their own nails, whether what the condition of the toenails were, whether there were calluses.
And why does that matter?
And it matters because those are the things that if you have painful feet, they make you unstable. He recognized that the woman was on multiple medications, some of which were dehydrating her and making her dizzy. He recognized that her nutritional issues were...
Well, wait, that issue of medication, there was an interesting rule he had, which has to do with having more than 4 meds, drugs.
Yeah, this is not just his rule, this is research evidence that most doctors don't even know. A patient who is on more than 4 drugs and is at much higher risk of having falls. A patient who has certain nutritional history, like having some loss of weight, much higher risk of having falls. So for this woman, the biggest danger to her of losing her way of life was that she would fall, break her hip, and in a nursing home, and then 50% chance of death 6 months later. So what he did, he changed her medications, he simplified them, he worked on having her see a podiatrist to take care of her feet, and he changed her nutrition. A year later, she had maintained her weight, still living in her apartment on her own, in her mid-80s, and doing remarkably well. We don't teach geriatrics to 97% of our medical students in the country. The geriatrics profession has fewer people who are being trained in it today than a decade ago, even though our numbers of people who need these skills are exploding. This has been our failure to value the skills that absolutely matter most to our future, what I will care about when I'm at that stage.
Do you think if we had a single-payer system in this country where the government was concerned about the costs, we pay far more for older people, right, going after that nodule as opposed to whether she was balanced, than if we had a system where cost mattered and actual human conditions matter of a patient?
Well, the irony here, so there are many things a single-payer system may be able to make better, but we have a single-payer system for the elderly, and it has not served these needs. Medicare, our Medicare system, some of it is for political reasons, right? We do not reward, one of the lowest paid professions in the country is being a geriatrician. Add to it that we've had this political debate where making sure physicians are paid for the time to have conversations about the needs of people as they face the end of life or face their more mortal problems, that even that was a political...
It was a death panel.
It was accused of being a death panel. I think we're beyond that now, and part of the reason to write this book now is that we have been able to, I think we're moving beyond, in both parties, the idea that this is about death panels. This is about assuring people that not that they have a good death. That is not the goal. The goal is as good a life as possible all the way to the very end.
We're talking to Dr. Atul Gawande, who is a surgeon at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, a staff writer for The New Yorker, and is just out with his new book. It's called Being Mortal, Medicine and What Matters in the End. We'll continue our discussion in a minute. Bilal Abdurrahman. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Aaron Mate. Our guest for the hour is Dr. Atul Gawande, a surgeon at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, staff writer at The New Yorker, professor at Harvard Medical School, author of a number of books, including The Checklist Manifesto and his latest, Being Mortal, Medicine and What Matters in the End. Aaron?
Yes, I want to ask you, in the book you talk about a choice that patients are often faced with in terms of choosing hospice care, which is translated to giving up, or equated with giving up, and then choosing dangerous invasive procedures, which is perceived as that's the fight.
Yeah, this is where I found I would pose options to people, and it would always be about, well, do you want to fight or do you want to give up? And I knew that wasn't the right way to think about it, but I didn't know how we might be able to think about it better. And what I realized was this frame of, it's really about what are we fighting for? So, you know, the people that I saw in hospice, what was amazing to me as I watched the work they did, they were fighting too. They were fighting for giving people a good day. And the idea of what our goals are, it boils down to medicine ordinarily says, we will sacrifice your time now for the sake of time in the future. But we have to be open to the idea that what people may want is to have us fight for, I want to have just my best possible day today, and use the medical capabilities to accomplish that. It doesn't have to happen that only happens in hospice, and that has been a huge mistake. If we orient ourselves towards the concept that we need to communicate to our doctors, if they aren't asking these questions, communicate to them what our best possible day is, what the life that's worth living for us is. Tell people our fears and anxieties, tell them our goals for what happens if our health worsens and what outcomes are unacceptable. Then we can have a health system that actually drives towards what we're trying to achieve. And the irony is, it is lower cost and helps people live longer.
Dr. Gwenda, you published a study in the Journal of the American Medical Association that found hospitals make a lot more profit when an insured surgical patient develops complications than if it comes off without a hitch, the operation.
I did. What I was looking at was this perversity in our system that we will pay more and more for procedures, but you know, if there's a complication, it actually turns out that the profit margin goes up for hospitals. So then what is your incentive to invest in keeping people out of the hospital, making sure the care is appropriate and not inappropriate, and then making it as safe as possible? No hospital's trying to profit by increasing their complications and deaths, right? The main issue is that you just simply don't invest in it. In my office, for example, we will hire a whole phalanx of people to check insurance numbers, and it always pays to hire one more to triple check the insurance referral numbers. But hire one more nurse could contact the patients earlier, keep them out of the hospital by catching problems after they've left from the operations I do. You have to fight for it because there's no margin in being able to pay for that.
I wanted to ask you about the issue of assisted suicide. Brittany Maynard is a 29-year-old woman diagnosed with an aggressive form of terminal brain cancer. She's using the last weeks of her life to advocate for expanding Americans' access to doctor-assisted suicide. Maynard moved from California to Oregon so she could benefit from its death with dignity law. This is an excerpt from a video she appears in about the life-ending medication she gained access to in Oregon.
I don't wake up every day and look at it. It's in a safe spot, and I know that it's there when I need it. I plan to be surrounded by my immediate family, which is my husband and my mother and my stepfather and my best friend, who's also a physician, and probably not much more people. And I will die upstairs in my bedroom that I share with my husband, with my mother and my husband by my side, and pass peacefully with some music that I like in the background.
That's Brittany Maynard. She's chosen to die on November 1st so she can celebrate her husband's birthday with him the previous day. Your take on this issue of assisted suicide?
Look, I think that if we are unwilling to recognize that when people have unbearable suffering that we can do nothing about, that they need to be allowed to have an option where they can relieve that suffering. And if I had the chance to vote for whether I'd allow for a safe approach like they've been taking in Oregon and Washington, I would be in favor. However, I'm worried about the goal that a good death is our aim. The goal is as good a life as possible all the way to the very end. And the fear and concern that Brittany has is that they won't be allowed that possibility, that they will just have suffering towards the end. About less than 1% of patients in Washington and Oregon end up choosing this option. And what's really interesting to me is that just having the medication, less than half of them end up actually using it. It just relieves them to know that they have that option if it needs to be there. The critical parts are that we have the capability to relieve pain, to relieve nausea, to relieve many of the terrible symptoms that people have. And we also have the capacity to help them recognize and achieve goals that they might have as they come to the end. Everything from being able to say goodbyes to people to, I tell the story of my daughter's piano teacher who was suffering in tremendous pain when it finally got in control on hospice, said, I want to teach my students again. And my daughter had 4 lessons with her before in her last weeks of life, and then a final recital. And what that woman was able to pass along to the children she taught, she didn't even dream was possible. She might have chosen assisted suicide in that moment of pain when no one was doing anything.
I just wanted to read to you what a viewer just wrote in. Said, a life as good as possible right to the end should include the far cheaper attendant care at home for people who don't need nursing homes but get sent there anyway because the system rewards nursing homes. Medicare does not pay for home care attendants, which is much cheaper.
And the listener is right. The ability to build, first of all, what people most want is the ability to be at home. And there's two ways in that which we mean that. Number one is that we are able to provide services for far less that can sustain people longer in the home, and we aren't doing it adequately. Second is that in the place, when you reach the point that you actually can't remain in the home, we put people in nursing homes that actually feel much more like hospitals. People have no control. There is a redesign of many of these places to make it so that they're smaller, with just a dozen people, and it's not organized around a nursing station. It's organized around a kitchen. The elderly are allowed to go in and open up the kitchen door and have what they want, which is previously regarded as unsafe. Well, that's why people want to be in their homes as long as possible. There's a whole movement called the Villages movement that provide basic services like access to a plumber and someone who can change your light bulb and someone who can fix your telephone, that are the very crises that can drive you into a nursing home. And it doesn't take that much cost at all.
In Mexico, they have the Day of the Dead, where families come together and honor relatives and friends who've passed, and they reckon with loss. We're a culture here that's violent, but does not deal with death in any approachable way to Mexico. Why do you think this society is so adverse to death?
Well, actually, I think it's changing. So there's an interesting, important statistic that's happening right now that I don't think we recognize. In 1950, the majority of Americans died in their home. By the end of the 1990s, it was just 17%. In the last 5 years, however, the number of people choosing hospice has now grown to almost 50%. So that people are shifting and having that experience and seeing it happen, not behind closed curtains, but bringing hospice either home or in a hospice center outside of hospital and nursing home kind of institutions. And that is a remarkable change. We're all starting to have that experience that, death is terrible, but death is normal.
What most shocked you, Dr. Atul Gawande, in writing this? You're at the top of the hierarchy as a surgeon. You say geriatricians are at the bottom. What most shocked you and what is most important to change?
What most shocked me was how simple the change turns out to really need to be. And the change is simply recognizing that people have priorities besides living longer, and that the most powerful thing we can do is ask people what their priorities are. We don't do it as families. We don't make it a priority in the homes where we take care of folks, and we don't do it in hospitals. And, this is driving tremendous cost. More importantly, it's driving suffering. And there's this core idea that is the surprise to me, that there is the possibility of still achieving a potential in your life, even in your last weeks of life. That there are amazing things that can happen, like the story of my daughter's piano teacher. That, to me, represents a picture of the future that we can have.
Well, Dr. Atul Gawande, we want to thank you for being with us, for writing this book and your others. Dr. Gawande is a surgeon at the Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, staff writer at the New Yorker magazine, where you may have read many of his pieces. He's a professor at Harvard Medical School, author of a number of books. The Checklist Manifesto, How to Get Things Right, is one of them, and his most recent is Being Mortal, Medicine and What Matters in the End. And that does it for today's broadcast. If you'd like to get a copy of today's show, a DVD, you can go to our website at democracynow.org. I'll be speaking at Trinity University tonight at 7 o'clock at San Antonio, Texas. On Thursday, I'll be at University of Michigan, Flint, and on Friday night in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Just check our website at democracynow.org. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Renee Feltz, Aaron Mate, Noreen Shake, Steve Martinez, Sam Alcock, Hani Masood, Rabbi Karen, Dina Guzder, Amy Littlefield, Daniel Began, Anna Ausbeck, Sam Ardell, Mike DeFilippo, Miguel Noguera, engineer. Special thanks to Becca Staley, Julie Crosby, Hugh Grant, Jessica Lee, Vesta Godars, and to our camera crew, John Randolph, Kieran Meadows, Carlo De Jesus, and Phil Raymond. Our website is democracynow.org. Read the transcripts, listen, watch. I'm Amy Goodman with Aaron Matek.